However, our next speaker is Jameel Jaffer. He's Deputy Legal Director of American Civil Liberties Union and Director of the ACLU Center for Democracy. Mr. Jaffer was co-lead counsel for the ACLU versus Department of Defense, which released thousands of documents about prisoner abuse in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo Bay. He was also lead counsel in Doe versus Ashcroft, which challenged national security letters under the Patriot Act. Jameel, please.
So let me start as Mark did by thanking Professor Cole and Bill Roller for putting this together. The question that was just asked, the question about why, if all of this is so clear, haven't we seen any prosecutions? I think that's an interesting question, and I think that there's a sense in which the Abu Ghraib photographs were counterproductive from an advocacy standpoint, from the standpoint of somebody who litigates what I'll call accountability cases. The Abu Ghraib photographs were counterproductive because I bet when all of you think about the abuse that took place in detention facilities during the Bush administration, the first thing that comes to mind are those photographs. Those photographs stay in your mind in a way that text doesn't. And the result is that people think that that was the limit of what took place. And in fact, that was not nearly the limit. It resembled some things that took place in the CIA's facilities, but if you read the memos that Mark was just reading, you can see that they went much further than what happened in the Abu Ghraib photographs. You can see that they, for example, waterboarded prisoners. And if you look at the documents that have come to light as a result of Freedom of Information Act litigation, you can see that in many cases the abuse went even further than the CIA memos describe. Through the Freedom of Information Act, we've been able to get about 100 autopsy reports of prisoners who died in U.S. custody. This is over a 4-year period from about 2002 to 2006. 100 prisoners died in U.S. custody. Of those prisoners, about 24 were found to have died. 24 cases were homicides, and military investigators found that they were homicides. You can see the autopsy reports on our website. At the bottom it says homicide, finding, homicide, and it's a U.S. Army document. And about 12 cases involve prisoners who were killed in the course of interrogations. And again, this is not a conclusion that I'm drawing from the documents. These are conclusions that are drawn in the documents themselves. And these are documents that have been in the public domain now for several years. But I still think that when people think about abuse during the Bush administration, they don't think of those documents, they think of the photographs. And I think that that is at least a small part of the explanation for why we haven't seen prosecutions. It's because people still don't fully understand the scope of what I will call the torture program. I want to talk about accountability. What it means, what we need to do to get it. And I want to start by giving the current administration some credit. It's history now, and you may not remember all this, but in the first few days of this administration's tenure, President Obama issued a series of executive orders, truly unprecedented executive orders. One disavowing torture, another committing to close Guantanamo within a year, another shuttering the CIA's black sites for good, still another that committed the administration to being the most transparent administration in history. President Obama and the Attorney General reversed what was called the Ashcroft rule, which is a rule that favored secrecy in Freedom of Information Act cases. I'm going to start calling it FOIA, okay? FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. There was a rule under the last administration under which when people asked for information, they withheld it whenever there was an argument in favor, whenever there was an argument available to them to withhold the information. The Attorney General Holder, got rid of that rule, flipped the presumption, so now if there's an argument in favor of transparency, they release the document, at least in principle. In April of 2009, the administration released 3 of the torture memos. These are the August 2002 memo that hadn't yet been leaked to the media, 2 memos from May of 2005. These are the memos that really did provide the foundation for the torture program. I think that the decision to release those memos was everybody recognized beforehand and recognized after the fact that it was a politically costly decision. The administration did it anyway. It was a principled decision. They had committed to doing it before they took office, and they did it after they took office in response to litigation, but nonetheless they did it. In August of 2009, the administration released the Office of Professional Responsibility report that Mark was just quoting from. That was something that we had been litigating for many, many months. The last administration stalled its completion and then stalled its release. This administration decided to release it. They also released the report that overturned that report. With some redactions, but mainly they released it. Around the same time, the Attorney General announced the inauguration of a criminal investigation, and he appointed John Durham to lead that investigation. That too was something that human rights organizations had asked the administration to do for many months, and in some ways was a truly politically courageous decision that the administration deserves credit for. If you look, though, at the months that have followed the inauguration of that criminal investigation, I think you see a very different administration. Part of the reason is that I think that the administration decided that the political cost of accountability was just too high. Part of the reason is that the people who were the most aggressive advocates for accountability within the administration had been pushed out or had left. But starting in the summer of 2009, what you see is an administration that is increasingly an obstacle to accountability. And I think it's also fair to say that this administration, if the last administration can be said to have built a framework for torture, then this administration is increasingly building a framework for impunity. So what do I mean when I say impunity, and what do I mean when I say accountability? When I'm thinking about accountability, I'm thinking about principally 3 things. One is transparency. I think that the public has a right to know what took place under the last administration. And it is true that we know a lot about it now. But there are some crucial things we still don't know, especially relating to when particular decisions were made and by whom those decisions were made. So transparency, that's one. The second thing I think of is civil liability. And civil liability has 2 virtues. One is the obvious, that it holds perpetrators accountable civilly for their decisions and their conduct. But the other is it gives acknowledgement and compensation to survivors. And survivors have not been a large part of our public debate. Because when people think of survivors, they think of, for example, KSN. They think of the worst, right? But the truth is that there were hundreds of people who were subjected to many of these techniques in CIA facilities and Defense Department facilities. Hundreds of them. And we have proof of that in the government's own documents. And none of those people, most of whom had nothing to do with terrorism, and most of them had nothing to do with the insurgency in Iraq or the insurgency in Afghanistan, have not been given any form of compensation for their treatment, and their treatment hasn't even been officially acknowledged by the administration, by the government. The third point is criminal investigation. We do now have a criminal investigation that I referred to earlier, but that criminal investigation, as far as we can tell, is quite narrow. It's limited to instances in which CIA interrogators went beyond the scope of the authority that the OLC had invested in them, the Office of Legal Counsel had invested in them. And I don't have any trouble with holding accountable those CIA agents who went beyond the authority that was invested in them. But there was a problem with the authority too. And nobody thus far has been held accountable for granting CIA interrogators that authority. I want to come back to the 2 other points, transparency and civil liability. because I want to talk about what the Obama administration has done on those two fronts and is doing now on those two fronts.